One thing I love to do when diving into text completion problems is to look for punctuation marks that might tell me something about how this problem is organized. And so right off the bat, we have this semicolon. And what semicolons do, they do a lot of things, but they typically link together two independent clauses that are very closely related. And so what we have here is we have a complete thought to start with. Stories are a haunted genre. What does this mean for a genre to be haunted? I don't know. It's interesting. Hopefully we're going to learn something about that in the rest of the sentence. But that's sort of our first complete thought. Stories are a haunted genre. And what comes next is going to sort of unpack that and tell us how perhaps these stories are a haunted genre. So let's continue. Hardly blank kind of story. Just kind of linguistically, hardly blank kind of story. What kind of thing is going to fit in that blank? It seems like hardly a or an, because we're dealing with a singular story. And if we're talking about the kind of story, then it seems reasonable to think maybe this is going to be an adjective of some kind, because it's going to describe the story. I have no idea what that adjective is yet, but let's keep reading. The ghost story is almost the paradigm of the form. Okay, let's pause again. The paradigm of the form. What is the paradigm? That's sort of like, it's the best example. It sort of like demonstrates this form like beautifully. It has all the right aspects. And again, what form are they referring to? They're talking about stories, or the form of storytelling. And again, so these ghost stories are the paradigm of that form, which means they're speaking to the fact that stories are a haunted genre. Again, we're not totally sure what that means yet, but that seems to be important. Now, before moving forward, we should always ask, can we fill in that blank with just the information we have so far? Well, we have this interesting structure of, hardly, right? So hardly a blank kind of story. The ghost story is almost the paradigm of the form. Okay, so let's try to think of an analogy here. It might be sort of like saying, let's think about someone like Michael Jordan. He's sort of the paradigm of a basketball player. And so what would we say? If Michael Jordan is the paradigm of a basketball player, he's hardly maybe an amateur player, right? He's hardly sort of like a lesser kind of player. And that seems like maybe this is the structure they're working with here. And so I might just plug in sort of like a lesser kind. It's hardly a lesser kind of story because it's the paradigm of the form, okay? So that would be the words I would plug into that blank. Now we continue on. And blank was undoubtedly one effect that Poe, I'm assuming Edgar Allan Poe, had in mind when he wrote about how stories work. Okay, so we might know Poe, we might know that he wrote some really spooky, interesting stories, and we're talking about one effect that Poe had in mind when he wrote about how stories work. Okay, so he's writing about how stories as the storytelling form kind of work on us. And so if we're looking at these again, we have these two independent clauses. We know that this is going to be closely related to the start of our sentence. And it should come back to this idea that storytelling is a haunted genre. And so we want some kind of effect in this blank that's going to speak to this idea that stories are a haunted genre. And so maybe, I don't know, there's a number of words that could fit here, but maybe something like terror, perhaps even fear, something that when we talk about things haunting us, that's typically sort of like a negative kind of word or negative sensation. And this is one effect that Poe apparently had in mind when he wrote about how stories work. So now we have something that it's complete. It's got a nice symmetry to it, right? Because the second part of the sentence is closely relating to the first. And then we have this kind of intermediary section that has his own kind of relationship to itself. I like all the words we plugged in. Now let's see how we did in our answer choices. Okay, so for blank number one, first option is a debased. A debased is sort of like, lower in value. It can also, in some contexts, mean perhaps immoral. That seems like maybe a little bit of a reach. We're not talking about morality much, it seems like. We're talking about sort of more in terms of value, right? Again, paradigm of the form means it's like at the top of its class. Something that's lesser than that is going to have less value, right? Or less quality, perhaps. So that seems like an okay fit. Let's keep it in mind at least. B is normative. Okay, what does normative mean? Again, another kind of vocab word here. Normative typically refers to something dealing with ethics, right? So something that's normative is discussing values, and it tends to be sort of like a synonym for ethical. Perhaps even by connection, sort of referring to anything that's good. Something that's normative is sort of telling us what ought to be. And so let's kind of plug that back in. Hardly a normative kind of story. And that would mean, well, it's not the kind of story that's talking about values or ethics, perhaps. And it seems like, yeah, we're talking about value, but it seems like a different kind of value here. This is more ethical values. And this is more like the value in terms of, maybe we think about it as like a price value or a qualitative. That's a really bad dollar sign, but there it is. We're talking about a different kind of value here. So this feels like a little bit of, they're trying to throw us off the scent. I don't think it's a really perfect fit for our word lesser. Finally, we have meticulous. What does meticulous mean? To be meticulous is to sort of be very, paying attention to small details. Small details. Smalls details. Sure. Or someone who's very precise, right? They're really trying to get everything exactly right. And yes, many writers are that way. Poe was undoubtedly meticulous, but this doesn't seem to have anything to do with the rest of the sentence. It doesn't have anything to do with, a haunted genre. It seems like it's just a quality of writing that we want to kind of plug in, but it has no traction in the sentence. So I think C is definitely out. B is tempting. That's probably the one that people often go with. But you can see why it's a different kind of values. It's talking about ethics and the good, where this is talking about being a lesser kind of class of story. So I think A is probably our best fit here. Let's move on to blank number 2. All right, so our kind of words were like terror, fear, something having to do with an effect of a haunted genre. Pessimism, okay, what is pessimism? That's sort of, looking at the world as a glass half empty kind of way. That's my glass, and it's half empty. And so pessimism is sort of, gloomy. It's the opposite of hopeful. And yeah, some of Poe's works tended to be this way, but again, I think that's sort of, they're trying to get us to associate too much with Poe here. Keep in mind, all of these questions, they don't require any kind of background knowledge on any certain figure, any sort of historical or literary figure. So don't fall prey to certain things we might attach to authors like Poe. Again, stick to our words, which are sort of like terror, fear. Maybe is pessimism an effect of something that haunts you? Does it make you pessimistic? I don't know. It seems like it's a partial fit, and that should always be a red flag. It's not like a really perfect fit here. So I'm not going to eliminate it yet, but it doesn't feel like a super locked-in fit. Goosebumps. All right, so in Goosebumps was undoubtedly one effect that Poe had in mind. Well, when do we get goosebumps? When we're, certainly when we're excited. Definitely when we are afraid, typically. So something sort of like sends a shiver up our spine. We might break out in a cold sweat and we get goosebumps. Yeah, that tracks really well with sort of like anything that would be, haunting or haunted is going to give us that feeling. That feels like a much better fit than pessimism. So I'm going to keep that one. That's sort of like my front runner right now. And let's just entertain F, curiosity. And curiosity was undoubtedly one effect. So this would be saying that it's supposed to make the reader curious. I don't know that, maybe haunting things are kind of interesting, but I think they evoke a stronger feeling than just curiosity, right? They're going to evoke something more, sensual. And goosebumps, terror, fear, those seem like much more exact fits for what a haunted genre would be out to accomplish. So I think Goosebumps is going to be our strongest answer here for those reasons, and that leaves A and E as being our correct answers for this problem.